Hi everyone, my name is Stefan Engels. I'm a lecturer in the Geography department at Royal Holloway University of London, and in this lecture I will talk to you about how scientists know what climate conditions were like in periods before we had instruments to actually measure climate change. In this talk I will specifically focus on the glacial interglacial cycles that the Earth has experienced over the last, well, couple of millions of years even. So, before we delve into those very deep times, perhaps it's good to start by thinking about what climate is actually doing right now in this moment. And I guess everybody in the room knows that climate is changing. Climate has been changing over the last few decades, and climate will continue to change into the future. But perhaps we don't often think about how we actually know this. Now, from a scientific point of view, knowing that climate is changing at this moment is actually relatively straightforward. By now, we've got lots and lots of thermometers, meteorological stations, all kinds of instruments distributed across the globe that measure weather conditions. And from that, we can derive that climate is changing, the Earth is warming, and we can even go beyond that because we're additionally measuring things like concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, so we also know what the drivers are of this current change that we are seeing. Now, when it comes to future climate change, well, that's a bit more tricky because obviously we can't measure something that's yet to happen. But what we do have are these sophisticated computer models. We call them Earth system models, and they are based on physical laws. And if we tell those models what we think will happen with things like greenhouse gases into the next few decades or centuries, then the climate model can run simulations to predict what the climate response to those forcing mechanisms will be. And that is the way we are able to forecast what will happen, for instance, by the year 2100 in terms of global climate conditions. So we know what the climate is doing now. We know what the climate will likely be doing in the near future, but how do we know what climate was like in the past, specifically thinking about these glacial interglacial changes that I mentioned previously, so the transitions from ice ages to warm stages in between ice ages and back again. We know they happened, but how do we know about that? Well, the fact that there have been ice ages, that's been well known for quite a while, at least in academic circles, and that knowledge has been initially mostly based on physical evidence. And there's a number of different lines of evidence that people have used to reconstruct how ice sheets have grown over the past. So, for instance, if you look on the left-hand bottom picture here, this is a digital elevation model, a DEM of the Netherlands, which is a country that's as flat as a pancake. But then right in the middle of the country, you have these ridges that show up here in this orangey color that are roughly about 80 to 100 meters higher than the surrounding flatter lands. And by studying the makeup of these ridges, scientists have been able to show that these consist of gravels and other unconsolidated sediments, so they're not rocks, they're actually loose sediments. And so, well, the only reason we can explain that is that they have been formed by basically the bulldozing effect of ice sheets pushing forwards in times that are now long past. So basically, by tracing these so-called moraines, these end points of ice sheets, scientists have been able to reconstruct how big ice sheets must have been in the past. Similarly, we can find these kind of moraines in the UK and all the way eastwards towards Siberia. So we've got a pretty good picture of how big certain ice sheets must have been. And in addition to that, we find all kinds of features that we call periglacial, so characteristics in the landscape that have formed in an area that was just in front of an ice sheet. So for instance, in the middle picture, you see a former ice wedge being present in these sediments. Or if you go to the north parts of England, you find deposits from big lakes that must have been formed right on the margin of an ice sheet, so a proglacial lake in its scientific term. So there's all kinds of physical evidence for why we had glacials, that there had been glacials in the past. And over the last 100 years, we've also developed a mechanistic understanding. So you will probably have heard something about the Milankovitch theory, which describes the fact that the Earth is not orbiting the Sun in a perfect circle, but it's more of an ellipsoid. There are variations both in the axes of these ellipses as well as in the orientation of the uh, Earth's primary axis, and all these variations happen on tens of thousands of years, and combined mean that there are times in the past and also into the future where the Earth was receiving either more energy from the Sun or less energy from the Sun, and this has been the pacemaker of glaciations as we've seen it on the planet. Now, all of that is very large scale, it's global, but what we can see from current day climate change is that um, when climate is changing, the situation is much more complex. Different regions will have different amplitudes of warming or cooling. They have different changes in precipitation. So we need to know much more about regional or sometimes even local scales to fully understand what's actually happening in the climate system. And then also to understand how things like organisms, ecosystems, and even past human populations have responded to such climate changes. And there we have a problem. So how do we know about that then? How do we know what the conditions locally were actually like when an ice sheet was growing, when an ice sheet was there, or perhaps when an ice sheet had disappeared again? How do we know that? Now, to answer that question, scientists make use of something that's called natural archives. Unfortunately, when we go back further than a few centuries or so, we don't have instrumental records anymore. So we can't really go back to the last ice age to simply read out a thermometer to know what temperatures were like. So we need to find other ways to basically reconstruct what was happening. And making use of a natural archive has been the way that scientists have addressed this question. Now, what is a natural archive, you might ask? Well, it's not properly and narrowly defined. A natural archive is basically any place in nature where material stacks up with time and where that material contains some kind of information about what the environmental conditions were like at the time that that natural archive was growing. So that perhaps sounds a bit vague, but I'll give you a few examples of typical natural archives that scientists use for study. And perhaps one that you might have come across or that often speaks to people quite directly is the study of tree rings. So, as you will know, in our latitudes, trees grow annually and they form a ring each year in their growing season. And if a tree is happy, that ring will be wider. If a tree is not so happy, then it typically will be a bit narrower. And by reading out a record of a core taken from a tree trunk, we can say something about the conditions that were present as this tree was growing. And by combining different trees and different tree trunks, we can go back hundreds, if not thousands of years and reconstruct what climate conditions must have been like. Another example, one that's used quite often on slightly longer time scales, is the formation of stalagmites. So stalagmites also grow, well, maybe not year on year, but they grow continuously, and they can sometimes stack up a record that contains thousands upon thousands of years of information. And by analyzing the chemical fingerprint of the stalagmite, scientists can say something about the climate that must have been present as this stalagmite was growing. A third example are ice cores. Snow is stacking up both on Greenland as well as on Antarctica, and has over time resulted in the presence of a very, very thick pack of ice. It's over a kilometer thick in Antarctica and even more in Greenland. And this ice basically represents the snow that has fallen year on year. And again, we can read out the chemical fingerprint of this ice. We can also look at things that are trapped in the ice, such as wind-blown dust. And through analyzing everything that's present in these ice cores, we can also know what climate conditions must have been like on the timescales of, in this case, hundreds of thousands to sometimes even up to 1 million years. So really fantastic records for us to study. Now, the final natural archive type that I'm going to introduce to you is the one I'm going to be talking about more in the next few slides, and that is sediment cores. Because whilst it's very nice to study things like stalagmites from caves or ice cores from Greenland, that's not where people were living as climate change was happening. It's also not where there's a lot of biota, so we can't really study ecosystem responses to climate change. Whereas sediment cores we can obtain from lots of places in the world, from the oceans, from river systems, as well as from lakes. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a bit more in a second. But sediment cores are typically just sediment stacked up with time that we can then also read out. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more about lake sediment records. At Royal Holloway, we have a group that's very strongly focused on the study of lake sediment records, and lakes are fantastic. And you might not have thought about this very much, but lakes are almost like the central point of a landscape, and lots of material from the landscape around the lake will actually end up in the lake itself, and therefore a lake archive will collate information from all kinds of different spatial levels. So it will contain information on the very local level. So basically within a lake itself, each year there will be algal blooms, there will be plants growing in the lake, fish are swimming around, and at the end of each year some of that material will start to settle on the lake bottom. Similarly, in the direct surroundings of the lakes there's typically vegetation around, and things like leaves and seeds, they might just fall in or be swept into the lakes as well, and again that material will settle on the lake bottom. And finally, material from very far away can be transported into a lake as well. So you can think, for instance, about things like sands that are wind blown, and sometimes, in the UK, we can even have sands from the Sahara ending up here. We can have pollen that's derived from plants that are maybe tens of kilometers away that can blow into a lake. And rain itself, precipitation, carries a chemical fingerprint that tells something about climate. And all of these materials, again, also end up in a lake. And year on year, some of that material will fall down to the lake bottom, where it will stack up with time. So a lake bottom will basically start to accumulate year on year, and year will get thicker and thicker and forms a natural archive. And just to give you a rough estimate of how much information is contained in there, the average rate of sedimentation, so of basically material stacking up on the bottom of a lake in the UK, would be roughly about a meter per 1,000 years, or 1 millimeter per year, if you want to look at it like that. So if you collect a sediment core from a lake basin that is 10 meters long, you're basically probably looking at 10,000 years of changes in the environment. So, how do science go about studying natural archives such as lake sediment records? Well, first of all, obviously, we have certain questions we want to answer. We want to, for instance, know what happened during the end of the last ice age and the transition to the current warm phase that's called the Holocene. Maybe we want to know how fast that went, or maybe we want to know how vegetation in the UK responded to such climate changes. So we think about questions, and then we think about which sites there are out there that we can use to answer such questions. We will then go to such a site and collect a sediment core, which is a really fun work, being out in the field and finding out what's underneath your feet. If you want to take a short sediment core, which is a couple of meters long maybe, then quite often you can do that quite easily manually. But as cores get deeper, you increasingly have to use mechanical solutions to get that material out of the ground. But once you have a core, you establish its age. I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail, but if you're interested in that, you can, for instance, look up methods like radiocarbon dating. And finally, then, we look into the material that is actually part of the lake sediment record, and we read out that record. So we try to basically get the information out there that has been preserved by nature. So, what are the different clues that we can sort of unravel from these lake sediment records that tell us something about the past environment? Well, first of all, there's the actual physical sediment itself. Roughly speaking, you can more or less divide that into two components. The clastic component, which is the clays and the silts and the sands, so tiny parts of what used to be rocks. And in a lake sediment record, if you find bigger sand grains, then typically that reflects more energetic conditions, because the bigger a grain is, the more energy is needed to transport it. So if you start to find more sand grains and bigger sand grains, that probably tells you something about windiness or storminess in the past. And by contrast, if you find more organic materials, that quite often reflects an increase in primary production and reflects something like warmer climate conditions. So simply the physical makeup of the sediment itself will tell you already something about what conditions must have been like. Second, there's lots of other types of evidence included in macrofossils, so fossils we can see by the naked eye, and microfossils as well. And you've got some examples on the screen here. So from top to bottom you have a pollen grain, in this case of a pine tree, telling you something about regional vegetation makeup. We've got seeds, in this case these are the seeds of birch trees, which tell you something about vegetation directly bordering the lake. We've got a fungal spore, so in this case of a mushroom-like kind of organism, and we've got insect remains that's unfortunately hidden behind the camera now. But there's all kinds of different bits and parts of organisms that are preserved in lake sediment records that tell us something about what was living inside and around this lake and tells us something about the ecosystems. Finally, increasingly our laboratory instruments are becoming better and we can start to measure even the smallest things down to molecular levels. And one of the newest things that we're currently doing is looking at ancient DNA, so tiny parts of genomes that are actually preserved in lake sediment records, and they can tell us just about everything that was living in and around a lake, even from organisms that wouldn't leave fossils behind in a lake sediment record. So you can think about things like large grazers that are perhaps roaming the landscape. You wouldn't find their bones back in a lake sediment record, but we can find their DNA back. So we're all of a sudden learning much more about a larger part of the flora and fauna than we used to previously be able to look at. We're also able to look at things like isotopic ratios. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there are different, let's say, variants of oxygen out there that tell you something about if there's more heavy oxygen, it tells you something about climate conditions relative to when you have lighter variants of oxygen. And that way we can also start to really directly reconstruct climate change. So there's lots of new things happening by this sort of increased ability in laboratories to look at even tiny remains at the molecular level in this case. So by combining all these different lines of evidence, we can both directly reconstruct what was happening with climate. Sometimes we can even say how warm or cold it must have been, and we can actually have the evidence of the impact of that climate change. So we can see when climate changed in the past, how the natural ecosystems responded to that. So now I'm going to give you two examples of how we've used lake sediment records to learn more about glacial and interglacial times. And the first example I'm just going to show you is an example from an extraordinary site in northern Finland, which is called Sokli. Now, if you look at the surroundings of Sokli, you pretty much end up with a picture that applies to large parts of Scandinavia. Undulating hills, lots of coniferous forests that we, with a technical term called taiga environments. Not that species rich, not that sort of heterogeneous, a very sort of monotonous kind of landscape with the flora and fauna that you might expect from these kinds of parts of the world. Now, what's interesting about Sokli is that unlike virtually everywhere else in Scandinavia where bedrock is really ancient and acidic, here at some point in the relatively recent geological history there's been a magma intrusion, so some material from deeper down the mantle sort of bubbled up, and that has ultimately resulted in slightly different geological conditions and also the formation of a wetland. And scientists have been interested in this wetland for quite a long while, and over the last 20 years we went back there and we had a number of coring expeditions during which we found a very long and rather complex sediment record. And that is really quite surprising, because I haven't told you this, but when we start to look at what the what the ice sheet was like during the last ice age, then here you see its maximum extent. So here you have the UK and Ireland, here you've got Scandinavia, and this white line shows you the outline of the maximum extent of the ice sheet during the last ice age. So roughly 20,000 years ago, this is what the ice sheet was like. And if you then look where Sockley is, our site with lake sediment records, that's right in the middle of this ice sheet on the so-called ice divide. So we wouldn't have expected the sediment to form there in the first place. And even if there had been, you quite often would expect the expanding ice sheets to kind of work like a bulldozer and push away any loose materials, any gravel sands. They typically get removed by ice sheets as they sort of laterally expand. So that hasn't happened here very much. And I'm not going to go into too much detail as to why that was, but what we found was that when we used quite heavy drilling equipment, we found layers of coarse material, gravels, sands, really kind of rough, coarse kind of feeling clastic materials. And then we had a layer with very fine sands or fine silts and organic rich materials, and then again a layer of coarse material, and again a layer of fine. And that back and forth between coarse and fine materials happened 4 or 5 times until we ultimately reached bedrock at 26 meters depth. So we had quite a long sediment record there. We dated the lowermost materials to roughly 125,000 years ago, which matches the previous interglacial. So the bottom sediments were formed prior to the start of the ice age, the last ice age that we have. So most of the material that we have is then formed during the last ice age, and there must be big gaps because when there was an ice sheet on top of the site, obviously no sediment could accumulate. And the final bit, the final meter at the top or so, was the Holocene, the current interglacial. So we've got an interglacial, a glacial, and an interglacial, all preserved in a single site. And how you read a figure like the one you see here to the left is that when you have the figure showing a bit more up towards the right, the material that makes up the sediment core is coarser, and then when it goes a little bit more to the left, it's finer material. So here you again go to coarser material, finer, coarser, finer. So you see this sort of back and forth going on. And in this case, when there were organic muds, I've also colored them blue, and those are actually lake sediment records that are intercalated by these sort of coarser bits. So what we found was that each coarse layer of material here with gravels and sands basically represents a phase where the ice was advancing. So during the time when then the ice was actually overriding the wetland, nothing got preserved, but as the ice was pushing outwards, some materials were deposited, and also when the ice retreated again, some coarse materials were deposited again as well. So within the last glacial, we actually saw not one sort of expansion of an ice sheet, but we saw 4 times that the ice grew and sort of covered the location of the Sockley wetland. But then also intercalated within there are 3 organic rich beds, 3 lake sediment records, basically showing pictures during the last ice age of when the ice sheet must have retreated and must have become really, really small to allow for organic sediments to accumulate at this site. So from this we learned that the ice age wasn't just one static thing where it was just cold for 100,000 years full stop. No, it was a very dynamic climate period, and by actually studying all the evidence that we found within each of these lake sediment bits that are intercalated or interspersed between these ice sheet deposits, we also saw that each time the ecosystem looked completely different. Sometimes trees made it back to the Sockley site, sometimes it was probably warm enough, but trees simply took too long to migrate back north as the ice sheet was decaying, and also the sort of the fauna that was living there was very different every single time. So from this we learned that the ice ages were much more dynamic on the continents than we previously thought. So very different ecosystems and very different climate conditions each time that we had ice-free conditions. So that was pretty neat for us to find out. We knew from marine records and from the ice cores that there was climate variation on the high polar areas of the world, but we never had really found this in a sort of continental site in Northern Europe. So that was a new conclusion that we could draw from that site. Now, a final example is from a lake in Germany, Meerfelder Maar, almost perfectly circular lake which was formed as a result of a volcanic explosion. So you can see that this is kind of the crater of a volcano in the Eifel region in the west of Germany. The volcanic crater subsequently filled with water and formed a lake. And what's really exciting about this particular record is almost like a tree. This sediment record has annual layers, so we can see a layer of an algal bloom, and then interspersed on that a layer with mixed materials, algal bloom, mixed materials, etc., etc. And we can read that out like you would read out a tree ring as well by looking at individual annual signatures. And in this case, what you see here from right to left is that this is slightly older material. This is formed in a warm period towards the end of the last glacial. It's called an interstadial when you have a warmer period within an ice sheet, within an ice age. And you can see here from those white spikes, I'm not sure if they show up on your screen very well, that the annual layers are very, very thin. And then when we go into a colder period, that in the UK we call the Loch Lomond stadial, and on the European continent it's sometimes called the Allerød stadial. But basically when we reverse to colder conditions during the ice age, we see that these annual layers grow in thickness quite dramatically, and that's because a lot more material gets blown in by wind each year. So we see a transition here already from very fine to very coarse layers. That tells us something about climate conditions. And the cool thing about this particular site is that when we start to look at that cold phase, that stadial that lasted about 1,000 years, from roughly 12.7 thousand years ago to 11.7 thousand years ago, you see here that in this record from Germany that the initial bit of that cold phase showed lots of very thick layers. That's what this black line shows, layer thickness. And then at some point that starts to settle and finer layers start to be formed on an annual basis. And it's not just that. We can also see when we start to look at the chemical makeup of these materials that, in this case, the titanium content, so that's a certain heavy element that we find back, really increases quite dramatically at a certain point within this record. So within this cold period, again, it's not just one static cold bit. There's something happening. Some transition happens. In this case from windier conditions to less windy conditions. Now the final thing that I just want to point out to you before I go to the next slide is that there's a dotted line here where it says Veddy ash, and what that is actually that scientists found the remains, tiny ash particles from a volcanic explosion from a volcano that was in Iceland, and that exploded about 12.1 thousand years ago. So that volcanic explosion created huge ash clouds. Those ash clouds dispersed all over Europe, and in different sites we find this ash layer back. And we can actually use that as a what we call a chronological marker. So if we find that layer back, we know exactly where in time we were. And that really helps, because when scientists then started to compare these results from Germany to a lake from Norway, they also found this climate transition from differences in lower titanium levels to higher titanium levels within this cold stadial period. But where that transition happened was actually about 40 years after this volcanic explosion, whereas in Germany it was 20 years before the volcanic explosion. So the same climate signal was seen, but 60 years later in Norway as compared to in Germany. And that is really fantastically interesting kind of result, because that means that sometimes you can have climate change happening that looks exactly the same, but that is offset from one location to the other. And this is something that's really interesting to climate modelers as well, because they can use these kind of past signals to test whether or not their climate models are able to capture such sort of what looks like small scale differences, but actually which on human lifespans are really important climate signatures, whether or not their climate model simulations are able to grasp these as well. So what we're seeing now is that Increasingly, scientists are going for very what we call high resolution studies. We're almost trying to get to sort of, year on year how climate has changed in the past, and not just looking at that, but then also looking at how fast organisms, plants, animals, anything in nature really can respond to such changes. So when a dramatic and very fast climate transition happened in the past, how long did it take for ecosystems to balance out again? Could all organisms keep up with climate change, or were some organisms able to do so but others not? That kind of information is really important when we start to look forward into the future, where we're also going to see fast climate transitions and where we want to know whether or not our nature can keep up. Because ultimately, actually, compared to some of the examples I showed you a minute ago, what's happening now with climate change in the 21st century, both in terms of amplitude and speed, is slower than some of these transitions that we've seen during the last ice age, and also the transitions into and out of the last ice age. But we can really use these natural archives and our understanding from how nature responded to climate change in the past to better understand what's happening now, and also to be able to better predict and preserve what we have going into the near future. So I hope you learned something new today. I hope you found it interesting to learn how we can use these natural archives to learn more about climate change, responses to climate change. And if you want to know more, then please visit our website or any of our social media. Thank you.